Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and the developers just put out a dev blog detailing the changes they're looking at for the armor-piercing high explosive shells in the game of War Thunder. I will have a link in the description to that blog, and I really wanted to do a video detailing exactly how they're changing it because it turns out APHE shells are some of the most common shells you can find between 1.0 and 7.7, meaning this will be a pretty drastic change to the game, at least on par with things like overpressure and volumetric. Now, I don't mention overpressure and volumetric lightly. While volumetric has definitely been a mixed bag with a lot of inconsistencies, I would say overpressure has been a net benefit to the game and is noticeably better than the older mechanic of hull break. Feel free to ask any of the older players exactly how much fun that was. But regardless of whether this new APHE change is good or bad, it's important to look at it and how it will impact the game. Now, the obvious first question is what exactly are they changing, and APHE shells in War Thunder have essentially worked like an armor-piercing shell that when it enters the enemy tank just explodes in a sphere like a high explosive shell. However, I have pointed out in previous videos this isn't actually how APHE shells behave for a lot of different reasons. In the dev blog, they helpfully show how APHE shells fragment and also specifically note that the main armor-piercing tip of the shell tends to remain intact, and the blast pressure to the rear of the shell tends to be relatively weak, while blast pressure to the side is noticeably stronger. In essence, this means instead of damage generally occurring in a sphere around the shell that goes equally in all directions, you get a much higher concentration in the frontal arc. In this damage heat map, we can see how Gaijin is effectively proposing to change the shell. The current APHE shell is just doing damage in a uniform sphere, while the proposed change would involve noticeably less blast pressure immediately behind and even to the sides of the shell. It would involve significantly higher blast pressure in front of the shell, and additionally would also involve the armor-piercing tip acting as a projectile that could itself hit things like internal bulkheads and create additional shrapneling. While all that is well and good, let's look at the actual models provided by Gaijin to show examples of what exactly they're looking at. In this first example, we see the APHE round hitting the hull of the Tiger and doing fairly uniform damage all around, as you would expect. Very notably, it's also not hitting the engine, and it is definitely taking out the crew member closest to its detonation point. In the after, we see the damage cone has narrowed significantly and we're doing a lot more damage to things like the driver and the gunner, and also we're hitting the engine because we have that projectile, the armor-piercing tip, that is continuing to fly backwards. Next up, we have a demonstration of hits to the cupola, and this is the most telling for me. You can see in the normal one that we get right now, it's wiping out basically the entire turret crew. However, under the updated APHE modeling, a hit to the cupola is only wiping out the commander and is basically not touching anything else. Now, a few bookkeeping things to get out of the way before we do our analysis. Gaijin is currently running a poll, and you can vote on it as to whether you want these changes implemented or not. Additionally, they have announced they will have a test server where people can try this out, which I think is a great idea. So you should definitely keep an eye out for the test event going to test out these APHE shells if you want to get an advanced preview of exactly what this will do and how it will impact the game. Additionally, a lot of my analysis as to how this will impact the game will be based on the idea that this change is implemented correctly, which may or may not be correct. The developers don't exactly have the best track record with implementing all of this stuff consistently. Additionally, while the armor-piercing tip was listed as a projectile, exactly how much damage it'll do, especially when hitting things like internal bulkheads, is still kind of up in the air, and it's unclear how much shrapneling you're going to get off of those bulkheads when this impacts them. So the first and most obvious effect that is adequately demonstrated by the models they provided us is that cupola shots are no longer going to be kill shots. You're only taking out the commander, and the commander is generally a non-replaceable crew. If all you have is a commander, loader, gunner, and driver, nobody will move to replace him, so you can only take out one crew member by hitting this part of the tank if these changes go through. This will essentially make cupola shots a pretty bad idea unless you have a particularly powerful high explosive shell you can load that will still generate those effects as normal. The second rather interesting effect is shots to things like the lower plate. Since it's going at a steep angle and you have a concentrated but also pretty narrow cone of damage, it's very likely hits to the lower plate, especially on taller tanks, is not really going to do all that much damage outside of taking out the driver and possibly the engine. Additionally, hits to things like machine gun ports is almost certainly just going to take out crew members that are in a line with that machine gun port, in addition to the armor-piercing cap taking out the engine, so that is going to be a pretty significant change, as often right now hits the machine gun port can wipe out the entire vehicle. Another pretty notable change that will definitely affect quite a few vehicles is hitting things like the foreheads of enemy tanks or the lower sides of enemy tanks are going to be significantly less efficient, because obviously if your cone is moving mostly forward, you're not going to take out the entire crew like you currently can with a lot of the more powerful APHE rounds. In fact, you're probably only going to get 1 or 2 people and possibly the engine. One very interesting change that I am eager to test, although I'm not sure how it's going to work out, is if you are behind an enemy tank and you shoot the engine. Currently, with the way APHE shells work, all it does is detonate the shell in the engine and essentially does nothing to the crew, so all it will do is immobilize the enemy. However, with the armor-piercing cap, it's possible that the cap hitting the firewall will actually generate enough shrapnel to do meaningful damage to the crew. If that's the case, shooting the back of the hull might actually be a better shot than the turret, but I'll have to check it out. Additionally, for lower caliber APHE rounds, something in the 20 to 30 millimeter range that have traditionally had trouble just because they don't have a ton of explosive mass, giving them a more concentrated forward damage cone will probably result in them doing more consistent damage, whereas right now a lot of these very low caliber APHE shells can often hit people directly in the face and still not take them out. So the obvious question with a change like this is, who does it benefit and who does it hurt? Obviously, a nation like Israel that doesn't have a whole lot of vehicles that have APHE or that are even in the brackets that use APHE are going to be largely unaffected. Nations like France and Britain that largely use solid shot AP will end up with a slight net buff, as on the whole this is going to be more of a nerf than a buff to APHE rounds, even though that ballistic cap will give it a little bit of extra punch. Soviet vehicles on the whole are going to be a mixed bag, because as of right now a lot of Soviet tanks have somewhat weak penetration but very high explosive filler and very good angled performance. So a lot of Soviet tanks can basically just find any plate no matter how thin and get an APHE round into your crew compartment, and the very high explosive filler will often cause straight up kills. Whereas under this new system, these heavily angled plates are often not going to result in very significant damage to the vehicle, 1 maybe 2 crew members at most instead of a full kill. That being said, however, the armor profiles on a lot of Soviet vehicles around this battle rating, like the KV-1, the ISs, and the T-34s, are incredibly obnoxious, and trying to get a shell into their crew compartment can often feel like pulling teeth, so getting that shell in only for its narrow cone of damage to not do anything vital is going to be pretty frustrating. The IS-2 1944s in particular, with their angled upper front plates, are incredibly difficult for a lot of vehicles to deal with, and the only way that's really balanced right now is by hitting things like the cupola, which will no longer really be that much of a weak point. The KVs are in a pretty similar spot, as it's often difficult to get shells into their crew compartment, and a classic frontal weakness for them, the lower front plate, will now do very marginal damage instead of wiping out the vehicle, so the KV's armor could be a problem that carries them even though their gun is getting a slight nerf, and the T-34 is to a lesser extent as well. On the whole, I'm not really confident saying right now whether this will be a net buff or a net nerf to Soviet tanks, as while the Soviet tanks do heavily rely on the crazy angled pen and the large explosive mass of their shells to take out enemies, they also have very annoying armor profiles that will likely see a noticeable buff with these changes, so it might ultimately wash and leave them in about the same spot they were before. Germany seems like it's the most likely faction to come out on top with this, because they have a lot of tanks with really annoying armor profiles, and they also have quite a few high penetration guns on things like Tigers, Tiger 2s, Panthers, and even the Panzer 4s with the 7.5cm L40. Trying to take out something like a Tiger when you can't really take out the entire turret crew through the cupola and hitting the lower sides of the vehicle from the front will often only result in taking out the engine and maybe 1 crew member, could be a real pain, especially for a lot of tanks like the regular 75 Shermans. On top of that, the reduced damage on the Panther that already has some pretty substantial inconsistency issues when it comes to penetrating its armor in the first place will probably lead to a lot of frustration. Ironically, the King Tiger is probably the one that will get hurt by this change the most, because that ballistic cap flying forward, if you hit the left or right of the turret cheeks, is probably going to hit ammo and take out the tank entirely, which is something you've probably experienced if you played some of the solid shot tanks like the French or the British. The combination of the annoying armor profiles and the high penetration guns should leave Germany in a fairly good state, as they will still by and large be able to click on the middle of and take out a lot of enemies, while enemies will be increasingly struggling to find places they can actually pen tanks like Panthers and Tigers and do meaningful damage instead of just knocking out 1 or 2 crew members. The nation that I would say is likely going to come out of a change like this in the worst shape is actually USA. The problem with USA is USA relies on its stabilizers to give it very fast responsive shots, along with the APHE rounds and the good ballistic caps, so it's not that difficult to line up your shot and put it in part of the enemy tank and have the APHE round take care of the rest. And with these changes and needing more precise shots, and even if you land those shots, you still aren't going to get that much damage, it could result in tanks like the Sherman being a lot less good. Combine this with the fact that very few Shermans have reliable armor, and the fact that previously it was actually somewhat difficult with something like a solid shot to take out both the driver and gunner in the same hit, but now a hit to the gunner is likely going to send that ballistic cap into the engine and immobilize the vehicle, in addition to removing its ability to return fire, and that family of tanks feels like it's going to be taking a pretty noticeable hit in power level. Speaking of the Jumbo's iconic weakness, the machine gun port is now not that much better than it was before. While it likely won't wipe out the entire tank, because your gunner, commander, and also your engine are in a straight line, and the new ballistic cap mechanic, it's very likely that a hit to this port is going to knock out your ability to both move and shoot, meaning you're not really that much better off than being dead in most cases. On the whole, it's hard for me to ignore the fact that American tanks are really balanced on their responsiveness and requiring more precise shots, and even if you land those shots, dealing less consistent damage is really going to shave down the responsiveness of a lot of these American tanks that can't reliably take hits. The only vague upside for USA that I could conceivably see is that if you're fighting against inexperienced Tiger and Panther players, they might aim towards the right of the vehicle and only knock out your driver, loader, and engine and leave you with the ability to return fire. Although in that scenario, given the armor profiles of those vehicles and how the damage is going to work, I'm not sure if that's going to be that much better than them just outright killing you. As a final thought, APHE rounds represent a pretty efficient crutch for newer players that don't necessarily have the knowledge of vehicle internal layouts to allow them to precisely snipe things like crew or ammo. In this respect, taking away this crutch could make the learning curve on War Thunder, a game that already has a steep learning curve, that much steeper. I would certainly like to see along with this change a rework of the APCR damage, since APCR was not shown in testing to be significantly worse than APHE or solid shot AP in terms of its internal damage, and this would present an alternative option to vehicles like the Shermans that might be struggling in this new meta. Regardless of that, I strongly suspect that if this change does end up going through, we're going to see a pretty significant rework in battle ratings in the patch immediately after this change goes live. But of course, those are just my thoughts. Feel free to let me know down in the comments, and obviously make sure to let Gaijin know what you think about these changes, whether you think they'd be good, bad, or you're indifferent to them. And of course, I would definitely recommend checking out the test when that goes live. If you enjoyed the video, a like and subscribe is always appreciated. As always, danke bitte, tschüss.